This sixth video, the fifth and final lecture on Descartes, concentrates on Descartes' theory of ideas. My goal with this lecture is to segue from Descartes to the conversation that emerges out of his, in some ways, troubling conclusions. I think a good way to do that is, after we've talked a bit more about Descartes' representationalist view of perception, to see how a different thinker, Sir Thomas Hobbes, took issue with some of Descartes' reasoning. So in the last video, I focused on Descartes' rule of clarity and distinctness as the gold standard for the kinds of perceptions that we can trust have truth and validity. Since our focus in this course is on our engagement with the world of sensible objects, i.e. external objects, we looked closely at how the rule of clarity and distinctness does and does not tell us about the nature of external objects. We found that the rule of clarity and distinctness requires the use of reason and logic to determine what is necessarily true. There is a way, Descartes thinks, that we can apply this rule to tell us about the nature of objects. There are some essential properties that we can logically deduce must be the case for physical objects. For example, it is logically impossible that a physical body would not have extension, shape, or quantity. If it didn't have these, then it wouldn't be a physical body at all. This is the kind of knowledge that we can know distinctly, and therefore also clearly. But there is another way in which the rule of clarity and distinctness applies to the objects of sensation. I mentioned this in the third lecture. Because we see it in the second meditation's explanation of what constitutes a true perception. Regardless how dubious our sensible experiences are in terms of telling us what is really there, what we can at least know for certain is that we are having a certain kind of experience, an experience of sensation of some kind. To get to that, let's review. We said last time that clear and distinct perceptions are propositions that have truth value. They assert that something is the case, and they are falsifiable. This means that propositions state that something is the case. This is an example of a proposition, though not of the kind that Descartes will say furnishes us with a clear and distinct perception. It is the case that this apple is red and shiny. We said that the word is what makes this a proposition available to logic. The is here is called a copula. It connects the subject, the apple, to the predicate, red and shiny. This gives us something to test. Is the predicate red and shiny true of the apple? But we also noted that Descartes sees a problem here. Proof for this kind of proposition is not solid as a foundation of knowledge. Why? Because it relies exclusively on the senses. It isn't the kind of proposition that reason and logic can help us with. It isn't a logical contradiction that this apple is red and shiny. It's only our own subjective experience of color that tells us that this statement is wrong. So this means that the proposition, this apple is red and shiny, is neither clear nor distinct. You have possible grounds to doubt it. Maybe you're colorblind. Maybe the lighting is off. Maybe the greenness of the apple is just an optical illusion. However, there is a way to make this a clear and distinct perception. Notice that if we change the sentence to, it is the case that I am seeing an apple that is red, that this can be true. Why? Because if I am colorblind and I am experiencing this apple as what I think of as the color red, then it cannot be denied that I am having an experience of seeing a red apple. So that you are experiencing an apple that is of such and such a color is a clear and distinct perception. It has solidity because it comes from inner mental scrutiny. It is within the realm of things that you don't have to rely upon the fallible senses to determine is true. Now, does this mean that this statement is impossible to falsify? How is this statement different from the thought, I am thinking of a Pegasus, which I said last time was excluded because it cannot be falsified? The answer is that this kind of statement is a proposition that is relational. Your experience of the apple can be tested against the proposition that what you are seeing is an experience of X color. You can examine your inner world to determine whether your experience matches the proposition. Is this an experience of red, or is this an experience of green? And this allows us to conclude that your experience of the color of the apple is true based on your inner scrutiny of what it is that you are experiencing. So just to reiterate, using a different example, Scrooge was not having a clear and distinct perception that the ghost of Jacob Marley was really there. Why? Because there were no logical markers, only sensation-based markers, to tell him whether the ghost was really there or not. Because he could only rely on his fallible senses, he couldn't determine whether the ghost was there. It was neither clear nor distinct, because he could doubt that the ghost was really there. As Scrooge himself said, he could well have been dreaming or hallucinating. The ghost was perhaps merely the result of some inner problem, a bit of bad beef. Nonetheless, we can say that it was clear and distinct to Scrooge that he was seeing the ghost, i.e., that he was having an experience of seeing the ghost of Jacob Marley in his room. You can imagine this in everyday conversation. Scrooge may say the next day, I still don't know whether the experience was real or not, but what I do know is that I had a terrifying experience because I saw, or I thought I saw, the ghost of Jacob Marley in my bedchamber last night. So the difference here comes down to whether you're talking about the reality and accidental properties of the object, accidental properties being the non-necessary things about it, what color it is, what taste or smell, or whether you're talking about your own inner mental sphere, the realm of your own thoughts about your experience. As a thinking thing, a thing to whom thought is essential, this is where you can have a far more confident and have far more confidence and solidity in the strength of your perceptions. Why? Because it's something happening within you. There you can know it fully and be certain of how and why it is true. So in the sixth meditation, the one we're mostly concentrating on today, Descartes returns to the world of sensation. Equipped now with the rule of clarity and distinctness, he sets out to find what he can and cannot know about the world of external objects. He writes, It remains for me to examine whether material things exist, and at least I now know they are capable of existing, insofar as they are the subject matter for pure mathematics, since I perceive them clearly and distinctly. This means that his goal with this last meditation is to connect his discovery that logic, mathematical knowledge, and inner mental scrutiny are capable of being true knowledge, i.e. clear and distinct. He wants to connect that to what he can know or what he can know about the physical world, meaning how he'll connect his logical thoughts to a world of non-thoughts, connect his reason to a world of non-reason, and connect his logic to a world of non-logic, i.e. that of the physical experience of the world. How is this jump going to be possible? What he discovers in the sixth meditation is that his rule of clarity and distinctness gives him a bifurcated understanding of both himself and his knowledge. What do I mean by bifurcated? I mean mind-body dualism. Descartes finds that he must have two natures, one that is of the mind and one that is of the body. You have likely come across mind-body dualism, as well as Descartes' role in establishing that now highly disputed idea. Instead of focusing on the kinds of questions that you may be familiar with, how is it that immaterial mind interacts or connects with a physical body, I'm going to point specifically and exclusively to what the implications of this dualism are in Descartes' theory of both imagination and perception. Here is Descartes' identification of his mind as separate from the body. He writes, "But nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body, and can exist without it." He got to that by establishing that whatever he can clearly and distinctly perceive as separable and as distinct must be its own distinct thing. And since he can conceive of the mind as existing without the body, and he can understand these two as having clearly different natures, it must mean that the mind and the body are distinct. But he doesn't stop there. He finds another important, especially for us, distinction within his ideas. He finds that he has ideas that come from pure understanding, ideas about himself as a thinking thing, ideas about logic and mathematical truths, and also another kind of idea that can only derive from sensation and direct experience with the external world. Looking within, he concludes that those ideas of sensation are real. Like I said earlier, Descartes does think that, regardless of whether your experience is actually reflecting a truth about the object, the fact that you are having a sensory experience is itself clear and distinct. And yet, ideas about color, shape, texture, taste, smell, and so on can't have their origin in him. The only way that these ideas are possible is that he must have had some external kind of experience. These are the kinds of things that adhere to objects. The ideas may be inside of him, but they have to have come from outside him at some point. He recognizes that ideas about color, taste, smell, and so on are not the result of reflection or active thinking. Ideas that come from sensation come to you passively, meaning that you don't really control them. Your body unthinkingly picks these up. This means that there must be a non-intellectual aspect to his knowledge. He is more than just a thinking thing. He must also have a body, a non-thinking aspect of himself that can passively and unthinkingly receive this kind of sensory stimulation. Though note, the body cannot, for Descartes, have the kind of essential status that his mind has. His argument has told him that only the fact that he thinks is essential to him. It is logically possible that he does not have a body, while it's logically impossible that he is not thinking, if that is, he is having a thought about what it is that he is. So here we do get an important, clear, and distinct perception. He must logically have a body. This is the only logical explanation for where the thoughts about colors, tastes, smells, and so on come from. Therefore, he can say that he truly knows this as a necessary truth, which means it is distinct, which means it's also clear. Here is where Descartes draws this conclusion. But it is clear that these other faculties, if they exist, must be in a corporeal or extended substance and not an intellectual one. For the clear and distinct conception of them includes extension, but does not include any intellectual act whatsoever. But remember, he's already identified that the sensory perception of objects is only reliable when talking about our experience of them. He can say with certainty that there must be external objects. But what he cannot say with certainty is whether the ideas he has of those external objects actually matches what the objects are like. Let's call this the nature of things in themselves. We'll see this in a few weeks. We'll see in a few weeks that this wording, things in themselves, and this problem will come up again in Kant. Just like that red or green apple, our experience of the color of the apple is not necessarily an accurate reflection of what the apple's color truly is, of the thing in itself. Here's Descartes' explanation. And from the fact that I perceive by my senses a great variety of colors, sounds, smells, and tastes, as well as differences in heat, hardness, and the like, I am correct in inferring that the bodies which are the source of these various sensory perceptions possess differences corresponding to them, though perhaps not resembling them. We mentioned this briefly in the last video. Descartes argues that the place where we are most prone to error is when we assume that the ideas inside of us perfectly match the things outside of us. Doesn't this make sense? Your experience of objects and things outside you are entirely dependent upon how you are experiencing them. If they're different than how you can possibly experience them, how would you know that? And what's more, there seems to be a lot of proof that these kinds of mistakes happen all the time. Our sensory experiences of things are often just simply wrong. The senses give us an incorrect picture of what the world really is. And here, like here, the refraction of the light makes us think the straw is bent, but it's not. Now, if you're wondering why we conclude that the straw is not bent, Descartes will argue that it is because you have a more solid kind of idea about what is happening here. You have an intellectual idea, i.e. from reason, about the properties of light and water that give you a more accurate picture of what is happening here, more accurate than sensation does. If that sounds strange to you, if you think that sensation must surely be the way we also find out that the straw is not bent and that water can bend light, then hang on. Hobbes will totally agree with you, but we'll get to that. As for Descartes, he thinks that there are clear examples of ideas that we've adopted based on sensation that are wrong. Only the intellect and reasoning can fix those mistakes, those fallible, not clear and distinct perceptions. For example, if we only relied on sensation, we would think that an empty space is truly void of anything. But this isn't true. Empty space is filled with something. It's just invisible to us. It has air, molecules, etc. Here's Descartes. There are, however, many other things which I may appear to have been taught by nature, but which in reality I acquired not from nature, but from a habit of making ill-considered judgments. And it is therefore quite possible that these are false. Like what? He goes on. Cases in point are the belief that any space in which nothing is occurring to stimulate my senses must be empty, or that the heat in a body is something exactly resembling the idea of heat which is in me. This also applies to things like color, taste, texture. He writes, and that when a body is white or green, the selfsame whiteness or greenness which I perceive through my senses is not necessarily present in the object. In the next video, I'll give contemporary scientific credence to this when I talk about Locke, who does agree with Descartes on this point. What we experience as color is just the reflection of light off the object. But that color isn't necessarily in the object. That experience of color is how our eyes take in the color bouncing off or the light bouncing off that object. For now, with Descartes, we find him prioritizing purely internal sensations over these kinds of external sensations of objects. That we have an idea of color tells us that there are external objects that provoke that kind of experience in us. But a more reliable kind of sensation is the kind that is purely of our own bodies. That we feel pain, hunger, thirst, and so on. Sensation can lead us to relative certainty about our own bodies, much more so than they can tell us about external things. He writes, "My nature, then, in this limited sense, does indeed teach me to avoid what induces a feeling of pain, and to seek out what induces feelings of pleasure, and so on. But it does not appear to teach us to draw any conclusions from these sensory perceptions about things located outside us, without waiting until the intellect has examined the matter." So just to reiterate, he goes on, "Although I feel heat when I go near a fire and feel pain when I go too near, there is no convincing argument for supposing that there is something in the fire which resembles the heat, any more than for supposing that there is something which resembles the pain. There is simply no reason to suppose that there is something in the fire, whatever it may eventually turn out to be, which produces in us the feelings of heat or pain." In other words, this just reaffirms what we said earlier. We can reliably say that sticking our hand in the fire feels hot and causes pain. But what we cannot conclude, without the help of reason and intellectual analysis, is whether there is genuinely something in the fire that causes those feelings in us. So there is some question here about how much Descartes is truly a representationalist. A representationalist, as I talked about in the very first lecture, thinks that all our sensory experiences are mediated by ideas. When we get to Locke in the next video, that kind of thinking will become much more obvious. With Descartes, he does seem to say that we can have a direct sensory experience of heat, but it's just that this experience isn't reliably understood as being a true reflection of the object in question. But since Descartes is concerned with certainty, he maintains that the only certainty we can have about external objects is purely in the realm of the set of ideas, and not the direct sensation about the object. What we engage with when we want certainty and knowledge is ideas about objects, i.e. mental representations. But those ideas or representations are not necessarily telling you what the external object itself is. They're telling you about what's inside of you with regards to the external object only. So take note of that. We'll see that again. We'll see that Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant all disagree with a lot of Descartes' conclusions. But what they all pick up on is this idea that what we engage with regards to the external objects of sensation is not the direct sensation themselves, but our ideas of these objects. In fact, in many ways, these philosophers will go even further than Descartes on this. All of the philosophers we are studying in this course, Descartes is the only one who may or may not be a representationalist, specifically because he does seem to allow for a certain kind of idea that is a direct result of sensation, even if he prioritizes a different kind of idea that is drawn purely from mental scrutiny or a mental representation. It is those ideas that are in our minds and not in the object itself. So, to reiterate, our ideas about the objects of sensation are in our minds, not in the object itself. That is, the heat and pain we feel in sticking our hand in the fire tells us something about ourselves, that we are feeling heat and pain, but they do not tell us something necessarily true about the nature of fire. What we are engaging with when we experience the heat and the pain that comes from sticking your hand in the fire is a mental representation of the object of sensation. That is, the engagement is with the inner experience that is sparked in you as a result of coming in contact with an object. As we'll see in the next few videos, this kind of representationalist thinking about sensation and external objects is much more prominent in thinkers like Locke and Hume. But the philosophical view that we'll see in those thinkers can be traced back to the way Descartes talks about sensation in this sixth meditation. But where Descartes differs from the other philosophers that we will look at is that he thinks that we are dealing with two separate kinds of ideas when we engage with external objects. This is a view that stems from his mind-body dualism. Descartes thinks that we have, on the one hand, intellectual ideas of the kind that he prioritizes as solid foundations of knowledge, i.e., ideas of pure understanding. And we have, on the other hand, sensory ideas that have their source in the body. What makes Descartes unique here is that he doesn't see these as two sides of our ideas, but as literally two distinct different kinds of ideas, ideas that are distinct from each other, as distinct from each other as he thinks the mind and the body are. Just as the mind and body work together, so do these two kinds of ideas. And also, just as he thinks that the mind is not dependent on the body and can theoretically exist without it, and is therefore conceptually superior to the body, so with the ideas. Intellectual ideas are dependent on the mind alone, on reason, and so are innate. This gives them a strength and solidity because they are not dependent on external things for their validity. Meanwhile, the ideas of sensation are limited and fallible. They are dependent on the senses, and since the senses often get things wrong, these ideas need to be taken with a grain of salt. They need to be tested by reason, by the intellect, for their validity. What you end up with, then, is not just a dualism between the mind as a thinking thing and the body as a non-thinking thing. What you end up with is not just mind-body dualism, but a dualism of ideas. Remember how last time I said that the imagination does not equal the intellect for Descartes? I also said Hobbes would disagree with this. Now is when I'll explain what I meant. The rest of this video is, in a sense, a part 2. It's where I will begin a segue to the empiricists who follow Descartes. In the third lecture on the second meditation, I emphasized that Descartes sees the imagination as a kind of sister faculty to sensory perception. The mental images of the imagination, he thinks, stem from sensation. In this sense, the imagination is the faculty that brings ideas derived from sensation to the mind. The imagination can manipulate, add to, or retrieve mental images of past sensations. Descartes writes, "The conclusion that material things exist is also suggested by the faculty of imagination, which I am aware of using when I turn my mind to material things." So in searching his mind, he finds images of material things. The faculty that he thinks holds these kinds of material images is the imagination. This gives him a clue that material things must exist, because the imagination can only get these ideas from experience of material things that are intimately present to it. He writes, "For when I give more attentive consideration to what imagination is, it seems to me nothing else but an application of the cognitive faculty of a body which is intimately present to it, and which therefore exists." But now you may be thinking, but wait, didn't he rule that out already? Wasn't that the point of the second meditation? Not exactly. What he ruled out was that the imagination brings us certainty, meaning that in the second meditation, his goal was to show that the imagination couldn't give us certainty about the nature of objects, certainty about things like how we know that the wax persists between being solid and being melted. But here in the sixth meditation, he does draw our attention to the role of the imagination in connecting us with the external world, an external world that the pure understanding can reflect on and make judgments about. He recognizes that this might be a source of confusion, and so he clarifies exactly how and why the imagination is not the same thing as the pure understanding. He writes, "To make this clear, I will first examine the difference between imagination and pure understanding." So as you might expect, Descartes will show that the ideas of the imagination are less clear and more fallible than the ideas of the intellect. But nonetheless, Descartes sees ideas of imagination and ideas of the intellect as acting together, particularly when it comes to engaging with external objects. But let's get a better handle on what these two kinds of ideas consist in. The imagination, for clarification, corporeal imagination, uses the memories that come from sense perception to conjure up a sensory-like mental image. Here we have a generic human thinking specifically of an imagination-based image of a triangle. Notice that it is pictorial. It is what a triangle looks like to the eyes. But here you have an intellectual idea, a pure understanding idea of a triangle. This is not pictorial at all. This kind of idea is propositional. It is a definition of what a triangle is. That is, a triangle is a three-sided, three-angled figure. As I noted before, for Descartes, these are two separate kinds of mental activity. One is a sensation-based mental image of a triangle, meaning that it is of the body, and one is a pure concept of a triangle, meaning that it is of the mind alone. This is a picture of a chiliagon, a 1,000-sided figure. Descartes uses this figure to demonstrate to us that the pure understanding does a better job at telling us about the nature of objects, specifically because it is not dependent on the senses. When you think of a chiliagon based on a mental picture, it's imprecise. If you recall the image I just showed you, are you sure that the mental image you have actually has 1,000 sides? Maybe your mental image only actually has 500 sides, or maybe just 86 sides. But look on the intellectual idea side. There's no lack of precision. Using an intellectual definition of a chiliagon, you know precisely that your idea has the exact number of sides, just as a matter of course. The definition of a chiliagon is a 1,000-sided figure, and that is precisely how many sides the intellectual idea of a chiliagon has. Here's another way to show how much better the intellect is at this than the imagination. Quick, picture a septagon. Intellectually, you know that a septagon is a 7-sided figure. That is instant. But the imagination has to move much more slowly, searching the memory for one you've seen somewhere before. Here's Descartes' explanation. But suppose I am dealing with a pentagon. I can, of course, understand the figure of a chiliagon without the help of the imagination, but I can also imagine a pentagon by applying the mind's eye to its 5 sides and the area contained within them. And in doing this, I notice quite clearly that imagination requires a peculiar effort of mind which is not required for understanding. This additional effort of mind clearly shows the difference between imagination and pure understanding. And here we get the conclusion, the key difference between imagination and understanding. So the difference between the imagination and pure understanding may simply be this. When the mind understands, it in some way turns toward itself and inspects one of the ideas which are within it. But when it imagines, it turns toward the body and looks at something in the body which conforms to an idea understood by the mind or perceived by the senses. So the idea that these two kinds of ideas happen so the idea is that these two kinds of ideas happen side by side, but separately, just like the mind and the body do. One set of ideas, a more solid kind, looks inward. Another set, more fallible, looks outward, or at least looks inward to find the images that originally came from something external. Okay, let's segue to Hobbes. That's Hobbes as in the writer of the Leviathan. Through Hobbes's critique, I hope to give you, first of all, some food for thought for understanding the implications of Descartes' view of ideas, as well as to give you an alternative option for how to understand the connection between sensation, imagination, and reason. Hobbes was writing at the same time as Descartes, and actually engaged directly with him on this very point about ideas. The reason why Hobbes was primed to critique Descartes on this point was that he himself had his own theory of imagination and sensation that directly contradicts Descartes' view. Specifically, Hobbes takes issue with this doubling up of ideas. It is kind of complicated, isn't it? Why say that we have two separate sets of ideas in one mind? Hobbes, by the way, is defending in particular his own argument about the limitation of our ability to have a mental image of God. But, as I keep reiterating, in the interest of not bogging us down with too much extraneous detail, I'm leaving God out of this course. Not because God is not an important topic, but because I want us to focus on questions of perceptions of objects. God is a matter for a different course. So here's Hobbes, writing, "Whatsoever we imagine is finite. Therefore, there is no idea or conception of anything we call infinite. No man can have in his mind an image of infinite magnitude, nor conceive infinite swiftness, infinite time, or infinite force, or infinite power." That, in a nutshell, is Hobbes' argument for why we cannot have an idea of God, the way that Descartes implies and sometimes seems to directly say that we can. For Hobbes, because you can't have an experience of infinity, you also can't have a mental image of it. But the point I want us to focus on, as I keep saying, the sensory perception side of it. For Hobbes, there is just one kind of idea, not two. Reason, in Hobbes' view, doesn't generate ideas. Reason thinks about the ideas that Descartes ascribes to the imagination. Hobbes writes, "Whatsoever, as I said before, we conceive has been perceived first by sense, either all at once or by parts. A man can have no thought representing anything not subject to sense." Meaning, for Hobbes, all our ideas have their origin in sensation. Ideas don't originate in reason at all. This means that you don't have two strands of separate ideas, you just have one. Basically, for Hobbes, ideas go through a sequence like this. It starts with sensation, then becomes an image in the imagination, and then the reason can think about or apply logic to those ideas now in the imagination. This can feel instantaneous in practice. In other words, you're not maybe going to notice these three steps. But the idea is that conceptually, you have a sensation first from which you generate an imaginative image second, and only then do you reason and think about that mental image that's held in the imagination. In a sense, Descartes is kind of saying this, and Descartes himself, when confronted by Hobbes, insists that this is effectively what he means. Descartes is not denying that our ideas originate in sensation and then are held in the imagination. He's not denying that the intellect then uses the ideas of the imagination. He's just making the distinction between the intellectual thought about the objects versus the sensory thought or experience of it. But Hobbes' critique is deeper than that. Hobbes explicitly thinks that the imagination does equal the intellect. For Hobbes, imagination and understanding are the same mental faculty. He writes, "The imagination that is raised in man, or in any other creature endued with the faculty of imagining, by words or voluntary signs, is what we generally call understanding, and is common to man and beast. That understanding which is peculiar to man is the understanding not by will, but his conceptions and thoughts." So he thinks that animals and people both have the capacity for understanding. It's just that in humans, the understanding is more conceptual and thoughtful. So to reiterate, for Hobbes, imagination does equal intellect. So now we see that there really is a true disagreement. Hobbes is denying the kind of dualism of knowledge that Descartes rests his case on. We get to see this disagreement real time in the third objections. The version I uploaded for you identifies the objector as Hobbes and has Descartes responding directly to Hobbes by name. But this is, I'm guessing, an editorial choice for clarity, because the original has Descartes responding to an anonymous letter writer, and Descartes himself doesn't actually know the true identity of the author at all. The truth is that Descartes didn't actually like Hobbes and didn't want to talk to him. The correspondence was actually deeply annoying to Descartes. It was hitting a bit close to home for him, and so you see sometimes his answers get testy. I uploaded as optional reading a fascinating account of how this correspondence took place, and also about the detective work that it took for scholars to confirm that the letter writer was indeed Hobbes. The reading I've assigned for this lecture is the third objections. I listed in the syllabus the wrong page numbers for you to read. I was being too conservative and trying to save you from too much reading and managed to eliminate all the passages that end up in this presentation. I should have listed pages 42 to 48. But I've decided this year not to give you a reading quiz on this material, so you can, if you want, rely on this lecture to fill you in. I'll also try to upload the Leviathan reading in case you want it and are curious. My apologies. I only just recently learned that the Leviathan, which as you may know is a political treatise, actually starts by talking about sensation and imagination. It's fascinating. So the next time I teach this course, I'll devote more time to it. But for this one, it just gets tagged on as a way to critique Descartes. Hobbes takes issue with a passage in the third meditation that mirrors ones I've selected already from the sixth meditation. Here's the passage under question. "And finally, even these ideas did come from things other than myself." This is Descartes, by the way. "It would not follow that they must resemble those things. Indeed, I think I have often discovered a great disparity between an object and its idea in many cases. For example, there are two different ideas of the sun, which I find within me. One of them, which is acquired as it were from the senses, and which is a prime example of an idea which I reckon to come from an external source, makes the sun appear very small. The other idea is based on astronomical reading, that is, it is derived from certain notions which are innate in me, or else it is constructed by me in some other way. And this idea shows the sun to be several times larger than the earth. Obviously, both these ideas cannot resemble the sun which exists outside me, and reason persuades me that the idea which seems to have emanated most directly from the sun itself has in fact no resemblance to it at all. Notice that the intellectual idea of the sun is nothing like the imaginative idea of the sun. Here we have on the left-hand side of the screen an imaginative idea of the sun that is small. It's approximately the size of a quarter. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we have an intellectual idea, the sun as an astronomical orb, which is far, far larger than the earth. The intellectual idea, especially at the time that Descartes is writing, is not at all derived from sensation. At his time, it would have been impossible. It was mathematical reasoning that determined the truth of what the sun must be like. The second image, then, is what the mathematical calculations tell scientists is necessarily true about the sun. That knowledge of the sun, Descartes thinks, is innate. How can it be innate? Because it is derived logically, mathematically, functions of the mind that are innate to him. Does this intellectual idea of the sun make use of sensory experience of the sun? Sure. But for Descartes, that's not what's important here. What's important is that the truth about the sun came from the intellectual and not the sensory side. And therefore, Descartes says that the intellectual idea of the truth about the sun is in one way related to sensation of it as a warm, glowing spot in the sky, but the knowledge of the sun as it really is not dependent on that sensory image. In other words, mathematical reasoning, i.e. logic, is what brings him to the conclusion that the sun cannot be as small as it appears to the eye, or the imagination. But hang on, is this right? Are we really talking about two separate ideas of the sun here? Hobbes doesn't think so. Hobbes says, whether we are looking at the sun with our eyes or learning through reasoning that it is much bigger than it looks, it seems that there's only one idea of the sun at any one time. The other idea isn't an idea of the sun. It's a reasoned inference that the idea of the sun would be many times larger if one looked at the sun from a much closer distance. In other words, reason isn't giving us a separate idea, not dependent on the first. Reason is just improving and modifying our first understanding of the sun as a small glowing circle in the sky. Hobbes continues, there can of course be different ideas of the sun at different times. For example, if one looks at the sun with the naked eye, and then later looks at it again with a telescope. But astronomical arguments don't make the idea of the sun larger or smaller. What they do is to show that the idea acquired from the senses is deceptive. So yes, Hobbes agrees that sensory perception can be deceptive. But just because you can get a better understanding of something by reasoned arguments doesn't mean that the role of sensation in telling you about the object is somehow eclipsed or negated. It just means that your impression of the thing is made more correct by further observation. In other words, your sensory idea of the sun and your conception of the sun as an astronomical orb are just two aspects of a single idea about the sun. Now here's Hobbes's view. These two images are just two aspects of the same single idea of the sun. They both have their source in sensation and imagination. Descartes is not impressed. He writes, here again, what Hobbes says is not an idea of the sun, but which he nevertheless describes, is the very thing that I call an idea. As far as Descartes is concerned, this is what he's saying. There is an imaginative image of the sun, but the logical and mathematical idea that is the basis of astronomical thinking about it is able to improve the deceptive sensory experience through further thinking and reasoning. That's what an idea is for Descartes. But I think Descartes is ignoring Hobbes's deeper point. Hobbes is arguing that Descartes is wrong to separate the intellect from the information derived from sensation. There isn't a bifurcation of sensory knowledge and intellectual knowledge. Just like for Hobbes, there isn't a bifurcation between mind and body. The mind is the body, and intellectual ideas are bodily, i.e. sensory ideas. Hobbes argues that the mistake Descartes is making stems from his understanding of the essence of the human person as a thinking thing. Thinking isn't what he is. Thinking is something he and all humans do. We think, just like we sense and imagine. Here's how Hobbes puts it. Descartes is identifying the thing that understands with thinking, which is something that the thing does. Yet all philosophers distinguish a subject from its acts and faculties. Hence it may be that the thing that thinks, the subject that has mind, reason, and intellect, is something corporeal. Descartes assumes that it isn't, but he doesn't prove this. In other words, Hobbes' view sees the thinking person as being part and parcel of the corporeal person. There isn't a mind-body split at all. Thinking stems from the body itself. This means that we apply the understanding, i.e. reason, to the objects of sensation. We reason about the objects of sensation as a single set of ideas. Reason, in this view, isn't dependent on sensation, isn't independent of sensation. Reason depends on sensation. And what is it that connects sensation and reason? For Hobbes, as well as many others will study this term, it's the imagination that connects sensation and reason. For Hobbes, in fact, propositional thinking, connecting subject to predicate with the copula is just effectively playing around with language. You might notice here an echo of a later analytical thinker. Wittgenstein is a little bit anticipated in this objection from Hobbes to Descartes. He writes, "Now, suppose it turns out that reason is nothing but joining together and linking of names or labels by means of the verb is. What should we say then? It would follow that the inferences in our reasoning tell us nothing about the nature of things, but merely tell us about the labels applied to them. If this is so, as it may well be, it will follow that reasoning depends on names, that names depend on the imagination, and that imagination depends, as I believe it actually does, on the motions of parts of our bodies. So the bottom line will be this: the mind is nothing more than the movements of our body." In other words, Hobbes traces a direct line down from reason to imagination and then to sensation, with all of it starting from nothing more than the movement of the body. And with that, I will leave things for this lecture. We will see this kind of thinking again in Locke, the upshot being that with Hobbes, we get a different way of understanding where our ideas come from. On the Hobbesian view, all our ideas stem originally from sensation. Reason does not furnish innate ideas about objects, and it cannot tell us about the nature of objects. Rather, our ideas have their origin in sensation, a single set of ideas that the mind makes use of, first in the imagination and then through reason. We'll revisit this again next time, and we'll see how Locke elaborates on this conception to give us a truly representationalist, perhaps even problematically so, understanding of how sensation, imagination, and thought work together to make perception of the external world possible.